E te atua manakitia mātou, I tēnei ahi, moia mātou whaiwha karo katoa. Amine. Tuhia ki te rangi, tuhia ki te whenua, tuhia ki te nāko o ngā tangata, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, tihe Māori ora. Ko te mea tuatahi hi mihi ki te atua, nana, nei, nā, mia katoa. Ko te mea tuarua hi mihi ki te hunga mate, haere ki te whare o te atua. Ko te mea tua toru hi mihi ki a koutou katoa, nā ka nohi ora. Ko te mea tua whā hi mihi ki te heki mai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō mai haere mai ki te whare wananga o nā toa whakaora, nā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Hi mihi hoki ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe, me te marae o oronga mai. Tēnā koutou I nā rangatira o te ope whakaora, I nā hoa haere, Colonels Suzanne and Melvin Fincham, Colonel Heather Rodwell, Colonel Wilfred Arnold even. We are rolling out the big guns for tonight. Captain Stu Tong. He mihi mahana tine ki tō mato kai kōrero I tēnei pou. Nō mai I Alan Johnson, Senior Policy Analyst at the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit for one more day. Crazy. I te noa ana nei te aroha. It is only a small gift, but it is spoken with love. We've greeted God this evening, and we've greeted everything that God would question of us in this place. We've paused and saluted those who have passed on. We've turned to you, I have turned to you, to those who have gathered, nā ka nohi ora, to the living faces. It is so good to see you tonight. It's good to have you in our presence in this place. We've said that we're open to the future and what is still to come. We've saluted our mana whenua and the local marae, te marae o Oranga Mai, and we've greeted our leaders. And we've greeted our presenter, Alan Johnson from SPPU. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Hudson says this of Alan. Alan has been a powerhouse for the Salvation Army for the last 14 years, representing a dynamic expression of the Army's mission to the nation. His intelligent and informed social analysis, grassroots activism, rugby league or something like that, isn't it? Yeah. Theological integrity, passion for God's mission have had a massive impact on the Army, both internally and how the Army has been perceived or is being perceived externally. I echo that, and I say this personally. Alan has become a good friend, a mentor, something of a sage which I've learned to trust. Nā mihi mai oha. Ko Malcolm Milne tōku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Reading SPPU's latest report, authored by Alan Johnson, Are You Well, Are We Safe? I could not help be confronted by the continuing gap that exists between Māori and non-Māori. The report makes this distance, this divide, even more confronting because it is presented as a separate table, hinted at throughout the report, but then at the end presented on its own. Is this gap between Māori and non-Māori racist? Racism is of course officially prohibited in our country. We're a country where everyone gets a fair go, and where everything is sweet as, where there's nothing but racial equality, open-mindedness and diversity. Racism in this country will never be tolerated, right? If it isn't racism, then why does this gap stubbornly linger between Māori and non-Māori? What is this gap saying of you and me? Even stronger, what is this gap saying of what we're seemingly willing to tolerate? What, following the imagery of Ezekiel, could it mean for you and I to prophetically stand in this gap? To help explore some of the social, political and theological significance of this gap and what this says of our collective, shared freedom to flourish, please join me in welcoming the one and only Alan Johnson to Thought Matters tonight.
He me atu kia koutou o tēnei pō. I whakaaia hau kia koutou manaakitanga, kia koutou āwhitanga, kia koutou aroha. He mihi atu kia koutou. Nā tangata o te opi whakaora, nā tangata whānau aroha, kia ora mai anō. I'm just wanted to thank you all for all the love and affection and support that you've given me over these years. I thought I'd say that at the beginning because these things tend to sometimes peter out with Q&A and squabbles and acrimony, so I thought I'd start on a good note rather than try and end it on a good note. Thank you, Malcolm, for that welcome. And as Malcolm said, this is my second to last day with the Army. We had a farewell lunch at Manukau this afternoon. And it's always sad moving on. And I'm somewhat apprehensive about that because I'm going to go and work for the government, and I've never worked for the government before, and I'm sort of worried that I'll be there a week and work out that I've made a mistake, but be stuck there because, some people who are my colleagues in the Ministry for the Environment where I'll be working have gone out of their way to employ me, and I owe it to them to make a commitment to that job. So I'm a bit apprehensive that I'll get into the government workout. It was a bad move, but we'll see.
Welcome home.
I was talking to several of you who are working in your retirement, and I guess one of the things I'd really love to do is to be able to work in my retirement in the same way and still make a contribution, more or less on your own terms rather than on the terms of someone that you need to pay the bills. So I'm certainly looking for that in my retirement too, to be going back to being the activist that I always am. And I have to say far more radical than you've seen me, because deep down I'm far more radical than you see me. So anyway, look, I'm here to talk in part about the State of the Nation 2019, but also to just update that a little bit in terms of the things that have happened since that was launched in mid-February. The title this year was called "Are You Well? Are We Safe?" And I got that, and it's in the introduction from a whai kōrero, or a speech that was done by a guy called Aroha, Te Aroha Marameka, I think his name was, who was from Ngāti Whātua, which is one of the local iwi, or some would say the iwi in Auckland. And he made this speech, this introductory speech, at a seminar I went to in September. And he spoke of this, "Are you well? Are we safe?" And it resonated with me because we'd been challenged previously to start to shift the focus of the State of the Nation reports towards the wellbeing agenda that the government is launching. And as you know, the government has said that the first next month's budget will be the first wellbeing budget. They've said that they want to focus public policy away from narrow economic indicators to broad social indicators, and that the budget will revolutionise the way we run public policy. I'm sceptical, I have to say, for a couple of reasons. One is, if you look at many of the budget settings, are very much the same as the last government. And in addition, the last government didn't just have an economic focus, they did have a social focus as well. So it's misrepresenting, particularly some of the efforts that Bill English went to draw more ambition out of the public sector than perhaps we'd seen. So, but either way, this idea of wellbeing is an important idea. And I think it's important because we do need to change the narrative. We do need to move away from this narrow sort of economic rationalist view of the way the world and public policy in particular works. And this is our chance to do that. And there's a danger that won't happen because it all becomes too vague and too complex. And what I've got up there is some of the things that the government's already working on. So you've got Treasury working on their living standards framework, and they've come up with this idea of 4 capitals, which I'm sceptical of because I think it becomes a little bit ephemeral after a little while. And so the average New Zealanders who really aren't that interested in massively complex ideas will soon lose interest in it. And then you've got Statistics New Zealand, which is in a grave state at the moment, given the problems that they've had with the census, who have come up with the thing that's called the Aotearoa Living Standards measures, and they're talking about ways of measuring these things. And then you've got the Children's Commissioner coming up with a child wellbeing standards as well. And so you've got the various parts of government coming up with their own standards, and I'm fearful that'll all be lost in the complexity and the vagueness. And so what I've hoped is that the State of the Nation report becomes the start of a conversation around wellbeing. And I'll explain how that's done soon, because we're trying to not simplify it, but popularise it, turn it into something that people can grasp as an essential idea, and not. I'm not suggesting people are silly or dumb or uninterested, but the reality is it's only people, policy wonks like me, that get really interested in this stuff. And when I used to go home, and when our kids lived at home, and I'd explain what I was doing, you'd see their eyes glaze over, and so. So anyway, one of the things that has occurred to me is that there are sometimes events that define a generation. My father was a 17-year-old sailor, and he was at the surrender of the Japanese in Tokyo Bay in 1945. And not that he ever spoke to me much about that, but he did write letters home to his mother about particularly the poverty of the Japanese. He visited, to his later health problems, he visited Nagasaki. So he saw people with radiation poisoning, and he saw the poverty of people begging and picking up the rubbish in the harbours that the ships threw out. And he was deeply, deeply moved by that. And that and the war itself defined his life. And I'd have to say for the worst, because the sort of man he was, possibly he would have been that man anyway, but he was a lovely father, but he was massively affected by that trauma. And I'm suggesting that in my generation, we'd never suffered the same trauma, but the Springbok tour had a massive impact on me. And I was just joking yesterday, a few days ago, with Ian Hudson. And I said, well, I was protesting and Ian was watching the rugby games, and he sort of was choking at that, because of course he wasn't, but I was presenting it as being like a rugby nut, but he is a rugby nut too. But the reality is that for many of us, and for perhaps some of you, that was our first exposure to activism. It was our first exposure to the power of the state and to the division that divisive politics can breed. And it was interesting too that we took great exception to the racism in South Africa until it was pointed out by Māori that there was racism here in Aotearoa. And for many of us, we thought, hang on a minute, that's right. Because what we saw in the Springbok tour were young Liberal Pākehā protesting alongside Māori, many of whom were gang members. And so we saw this sort of coming together of two groups that really didn't have a lot in common, except they didn't like the police. And the reality was that for me, that radicalised me. For me, that suggested that I needed to do two things in my life. One is to understand the Pākehā world, and the other was to understand the Māori world. And so from that day on, I set out to study economics and te reo. And I'm still not very good at either, but the reality is I certainly went back to university and studied te reo and to night school, to study economics and to night school, and then to university to study te reo. And I'm grateful for that. And for me, the Springbok tour was the thing that defined me, and possibly many people in my generation. And it defined us because we started to appreciate the nature of racism in our society. And we started, I think, to understand the nature of our privilege as Pākehā. And the thing I ask is, how will the most recent events define this generation? Will they define this generation at all? I'm not certain about you, but not only was I shocked by the news of these killings, but I was deeply upset. And I was deeply upset, and I think many people were, by what had become of our country. And I think the Prime Minister was as well. This is a country where this should never have happened. How on earth could it have happened? And of course, I think the reason we understand that is partly because we've left some very extreme views go unchallenged, and that beneath the surface of our society we're still racist. And that's becoming apparent again. And so we're having that debate, and I'm not certain whether it's going to last, and I'm certain that it may not go to where it needs to go, because I think the issues that my generation was confronted with in 1981 are still the same issues today, and I'll talk to you about those. I've sworn off Facebook now, except for promoting good news stories. I got involved in a Facebook dispute with a friend of mine who posted on her thing something about the guy Trenton, what's his name, Brenton Tarrant, should have been killed. And there was a stream of comments about, he should have been taken away in a body bag and all this sort of stuff. And I, as a good Liberal I am, said, it's important that we don't sanction state killings. I'm deeply fearful of any idea of state killings, because when it starts, a bit like Henry VIII, they won't know when to stop. And then someone responded to me, if it was your loved one, you'd think differently. So I responded to that woman. And then my friend Vivian came back and said, my friend, if you started at the top of the stream of comments, you'd realise what it was about. It was about the fact that this Pākehā who allegedly or probably shot 50 people was taken alive by the police. But 3 weeks before, a young Maori who had robbed a bank and was off his face on P was shot down without any degree of concern by the police in Te Teko or somewhere like that. Yeah, Te Teko. And that, it seems to be, for us Māori, it seems to be a different set of rules. And I started to look at the numbers of police shootings of Māori and non-Māori in the country, and really couldn't get to any conclusion. But since the shootings, there's been another Māori killed by police. And for Pākehā, we say, oh well, I don't know what you think about those, and I always regret it when people are shot by the police. But if you're Māori, you see it in a different way. And indeed, Māori do see things in a different way, because they have been the brunt of that racism for all of their lives. And I never really appreciated that perspective. And it caused me to think about, while we're now starting to examine our racism, are we fundamentally thinking about, as Malcolm has said, what sort of society we have and the basis of that racism? Or are we simply saying that as long as we're tolerant towards people who look different to us, particularly to Muslims, then things will be okay? And a friend, my son, who's in the football team, he was in the city just after the mosque shootings, and one of his mates is an Indian fellow who plays in the football team with him, and these people coming up and saying, well, I love Muslims. He said, I'm a Hindu, but so we're having this outpour of love for Muslims, even though some of them aren't Muslims. But the reality is that won't last, I don't think, unless we have a fundamental reflection on what's caused it and what's in our hearts as collectively. And so we have this march down Queen Street, an anti-racism march. Well, that's dumb, really, if you ask me, because who's going to change their attitudes because people walk down Queen Street? It's dumb, for me. But anyway, so all I'm saying here is that that Māori will have a different view of these events than non-Māori, and justifiably so, and it's probably important that Pākehā at least start to understand where that grievance comes from. And this is what Dame Anne Salmon said in a recent article by the ODT. The doctrine of white superiority is based on arrogance and ignorance. Since other cultures, languages and religions are worthless, there's no need to learn about them. The others are dehumanised, making their misery and suffering unreal. And then she goes on, this helps to explain our tolerance for the terrible statistics of youth suicide, incarceration and family violence in New Zealand. And indeed it does. And at that point I thought, I'm glad we put the gaps table into the State of the Nation report the month before, because it was the same concern that I and members of the SPPU had. That is that these statistics are appalling and we ignore them. And I always think that while we can't ensure that people behave better and are better people, we can at least ensure that we've told them what the reality is, and if they ever have to say why they didn't do something, they will at least be able. They won't be able to say they didn't know. And my dad used to say, and I still reflect on this. When I was young, about 10 or something, we used to sit up late and watch the history program, which was always about World War II. And there was there was a thing called World at War. Do anyone remember that series in the 70s? It was a terrible it went on forever, but it was just graphic. And once my dad said to me, "You know, Alan, at the end of the Second World War, they could only find a few thousand Nazis." And I said, well, I was about 9. And I said, well, what's your point? He said, all of this death and all of this violence and all this destruction, they could only find 1,000 people who say that were responsible. And I said, well, what's your point? And he said, everyone else went along with them. And I said, what's your point? I wasn't playing a devil's advocate. I generally didn't know what he was talking about. And he said, look, make certain that just because people go along with things don't necessarily go along with it. It doesn't make it right. And that's been something stuck with me. And I think all we can do now is to say to people, we bore witness of this. You can't say you didn't know because we told you. If you ignored it, then that's your cross, that's your burden to bear. And so that's in some respects what we're trying to do with the gaps table, which is here. And it's on the back. I've got these here too, so you most of them take that. This is the handout for the State of the Nation report, and the gaps table's on the back. And I'm going to go through some of them because just to explain what they are. But the thing was that a number of years ago we started talking about the gaps between Māori and non-Māori in our State of the Nation reports, and we weren't thanked. We were Māori, Tariana Turia got stuck into us and said that we were focusing on deficit models of Māori life, and that we had never talked about the positives and all of this. And okay, and there was a Māori media commentary which I got wind of, and they analysed everything we'd done quietly behind the scenes and told us, to their subscribers what we did wrong, but never offered anything themselves. And then, we from time to time, we in the Salvation, particularly in SPP, you get this it's not really hate mail, but it's certainly mail that's not very congratulatory, and people would ring. Look, you must have. I know Heather's received. Where's Heather? I know she received some when I spoke at a trade union rally outside Parliament once, and we got this mail saying that the Salvation Army had gone too far, and so people say they're not going to support us. And we had this mail when we started talking about Māori, non-Māori gaps. We had people saying, look, this is not what the Salvation Army should be talking about. So, because it's divisive, it's going to cause acrimony. So on one hand, we weren't, for Māori, we weren't congratulated for what we did for Pākehā. And so at some point, look, why bother? And so we pulled in. We didn't do anything. And there was a young Māori woman who's involved in the Auckland Division, and she's studying at university, and she was referred to by her lecturers to the State of the Nation report. So she was amazed that the Salvation Army had turned out this wonderful document. She read through it, and there was nothing about Māori in it. And she wrote to Ian and said, this is appalling, and indeed it was. And so we decided to get braver again and to do this. And I'm not certain it's had as much impact as we would have liked. Certainly hasn't annoyed as many people as we would have hoped. But the reality is, I think it's hopefully it will become a tradition that we stick to, and it will become a point of reference because we're bearing witness. And I'll just run through some of the stats in it. And one of the things here is, and we talk about it, that I think there's 17 indicators, and we say in the summary, we haven't chosen these indicators because they suit our argument. We've chosen these indicators because they explain the conception to death experience of Māori, and the differences for being Māori and non-Māori in this country mean to that experience. And we've chosen them because the data existed. And if we can find an indicator, social indicator, where Māori do better than non-Māori, please let me know. because I don't know of any. So they're not being selected opportunistically, they've been selected because they illustrate a life to death or conception to death experience, and they also data that's available. And I'll just run through some of these because there's a systemic relationship between them all, that one leads to the other, to the other, to the other. And for example, Māori are 5.7 times more likely to be in prison than non-Māori. The rate of Māori imprisonment is 700 people per 100,000 people, so 0.7% of the population. Whereas for non-Māori it's 100, so 0.1% of the population. And if we look to of the proportion of Māori who are convicted of an offence and then sent to prison, you're 2.6 times more likely to be sent to prison with a conviction if you're Māori than if you're non-Māori. And so we can see how, it turns out that more Māori are in prison because more Māori are convicted and sent to prison. And there's if you go back into those statistics, it's like an onion. You peel it back, and you just have more of an onion. You have more of a problem. You don't actually come up with a categorical answer as to why this should be the case. And for example, Māori defendants found guilty are discharged without conviction at 40% of the rate of non-Māori. And very few people get discharged without conviction after they've been found guilty. But for it's only 4% of the non-Māori population and about 1.8% of the Māori population of people found guilty. So Māori turn up to courts, they're found guilty, and they're far less likely, 40%, they only have 40% of the chance of being discharged without conviction non-Māori. And then if we look at Māori youth being charged with an offence, they're 2.2 times more likely than non-Māori. And it might be, for example, and I think, I'm not suggesting here anybody would say that, but I've got an uncle who's a dreadful redneck, and he would be jumping at the conclusion that is because they offend more. They probably do. But why? Why do they offend more? And we can look at some of that. If we look at unemployment rates among Māori and non-Māori, the NEET rate, which is not an education, employment or training, for Māori is 1.8 times the rate of non-Māori. So the younger people are more likely to be basically at home doing nothing. And as we know, that's going to lead to trouble. But then we say, well, why is that? Well, if we go back further and look at NCEA pass rates, that Māori students leaving school without any real qualification is 2.5 times the rate of non-Māori. So why is that? Why would that be the case? And if we go back further, Māori students are 2.3 times more likely than non-Māori students to be stood down at school for behavioural problems. So their engagement in school is a great deal less. But why is that? Well, if we go back further, we'll see that Māori enrolments in early childhood education are only 0.8 or 80% of that of non-Māori. And so I don't know about you, but there's a pattern emerging here that you can easily say, well, the reason there's more Māori in prison is because more of them are being sent to prison. That's true. The reason more of them are being sent to prison is because they're being sent to prison at a greater rate than non-Māori. Maybe they're doing more serious crime. Maybe they are. Certainly it's the case that fewer are discharged without conviction, and it seems as though Māori youth are offending, or at least being charged with offences at 2.2 times the rate of non-Māori. But then we go back, they're 1.8 times more likely to be unemployed. They're 2.5 times more likely to have left school without a qualification. And they will be 2.3 times more likely to have been suspended from school while they were there. And so you can see a pattern emerging. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting pretty angry about that. And I'm not even suffering it. I went to a course, I used to get asked, and now I won't, to go and talk to students, you see. And I went down to Welltech, which is in Hamilton. I was talking to them about radical stuff, about the Parkhouse Society and all this sort of stuff. And then mainly Māori and Pacific students there. And one of them said, why don't you get angry about this? And I said, have you looked at me? I'm not suffering. I'm the beneficiary of all of this. And indeed I am. But I'm angry about it because I just can't understand how we can sit by and look at these things and not ask why. And addressing the inequality. If, for example, we said, okay, let's start to think about ways in which we can address inequality, the gaps, not the gaps, how can we improve wellbeing? Well, if we wanted to bring the prison population down, it's quite simple. We just have to have Maori being in prison at the same rate as non-Maori. It's as simple as that. For example, if Maori were to be in prison at the same rate as non-Maori, we'd reduce the prison population by 40% overnight. It's a wonderful solution, except it's not quite as simple as that. So one of the ways of improving well-being is to address these gaps. Because you see, I'm really fearful that the wellbeing agenda is going to be one that says, overall, we're all doing well, and we forget about differences. That because the average child in New Zealand is cared for and looked after and does well at school and all of that, then that's fine. As a society, we've succeeded, and we've not looked at the gaps, and we've not looked at Maori position within that. And one of the strategies we could have to lift wellbeing is to simply address these gaps. And so one of the things I think is that if we stick to what the Treasury's talking about, and I think we might, then the ideas will be lost in this vagueness and this complexity and this aggregation of averages. And I think we've got to be very careful that we avoid that. And so one of the ways that we've done this in our report is we said, okay, we've looked at 5 areas of wellbeing, 5 policy areas, and our children, work and incomes, crime and punishment, social hazards and housing. These are the 5 areas that SPP is always focused on. And let's think of wellbeing in those terms, but let's not think of it in terms of numbers as much as statements of outcomes. That if we were to say that we've achieved those things, then it's a good indication that we've achieved wellbeing. So, for example, in the area of our children, our outcome statement, I don't really want to call it a goal because it becomes a little bit too corporate in this speak, but let's say that in New Zealand all our children are safe and doing well. If we can say that, then we can say that we've achieved wellbeing. If we, for example, say that our prosperity is fairly shared, our growing prosperity is fairly shared, that is that as our economy grows, that not only is that growth important for itself, but it's important that it's shared across the whole society, including people who don't work. If we can say that, then we can say that we're achieving wellbeing. If we can say that our homes and communities are free of violence and other crime, then we can say we've achieved wellbeing. If we can say that our homes and communities are free of addictions and the harms that causes, then we can say we've achieved wellbeing. And if we can say that we all have a home which is safe and healthy and secure, then we've achieved wellbeing. And so for us, that's the sort of, it's not really a measurable test, but it's a sort of a judgment. And so what we've done, and really if we look at, and this is our overall assessment, and it's sort of more or less in these pages. What's that? Okay. It's this. And apparently Ian and Campbell had a meeting with a church leaders meeting with, and I think that Andy may have also been there, with the Prime Minister shortly after the State of the Nation was published, and she wasn't happy, suggesting that we could have been more positive. And we said, well, firstly, it's not our job to be positive if it's not deserved, and secondly, we there was some positive stuff there, and thirdly, you really can't hold the government to account for everything. The government doesn't neglect children. The government doesn't underpay workers. The government creates some things, but it's not responsible for everything. And so we've said this is the nub of our assessment. Firstly, there is no evidence that vulnerable children are any safer than they were previously, even despite the changes that have been made in shifting it from child, youth and family to oranga tamariki, that there's no indication that things have improved and that children are better off. And in fact, part of the problem is that there's more children now in state care than there ever has been. And some of that's due to the extension of the age of care from 17 to 18, but around 600 additional children in state care for whatever reason we don't know. And that's not a good sign. It's certainly the case that there is good news around much of what teenagers are doing now. Teenage pregnancies are lower, teenage rates of hazardous drinking are falling, teenage offending is falling, and our achievement rates are rising. So there's good news that there's been a cultural shift amongst teenagers in terms of their behaviours and expectations in their lives. And I'm not certain what's driven that. Apparently it's a widespread phenomenon. I think part of it might be the example of their siblings and their parents, perhaps. They're saying, look, we're not going to live the life like those people have done. We're going to make different choices. I don't know, but there's a cultural change, which you can't really put down to policy, but is certainly worth celebrating. Although youth suicide rates still remain about where they are. And so that's not good news. In terms of our growing prosperity, there is evidence that particularly the minimum wage legislation is lifting wages for people at the bottom. About 6 years ago, the minimum wage was around 51% of the average wage, and now it's about 54%. So there's been this conscious desire to lift that minimum wage against the average wage. And certainly that's been some issues that Treasury have raised, saying it's important that we share this prosperity. The real problem is, of course, it's not shared with people on benefits. The benefit cuts in 1991 have never really been reinstated, except for a slight top-up in 2015 with Bill English. And what we've seen, of course, now is that the government spends $100 million every quarter on hardship grants. And these are top-ups on top of the accommodation supplement, which is a top-up on top of the core benefit. So you've got top-ups on top of top-ups. 1.3 million payments a year. And we ask, if the system's so good, how come you need band-aids on band-aids? Why is it that we don't go back and look at the basic settings of what we're trying to do? And what we've said in our report too is to say, if you look at around 280,000 people on working age benefits at the moment, there's around about 150,000 that are there for health and disability reasons. Those are the core people, regardless of what happens in the economy, who will be on benefits for most of their lives. Yet we don't frame the debate of benefit incomes around this need for adequacy and for a decent standard of living for everyone. We frame it around the prospect that all we're doing is supporting someone until they find their way back into work. And it's clear that many of those hundreds of thousands of people won't ever work, but we maintain them in a degree of poverty simply because we don't accept the reality of what has happened to them and to the society. And we're saying, at the very least, we should be starting to talk about radical increases in benefit incomes and indexing that benefit income to average wages, so that as prosperity is shared amongst the working part of the population, as it is indeed shared amongst the retired part of the population, because the NZ Super is indexed to wages, so should benefits. And that then we can make certain, firstly, that people won't live in the poverty that has become normalised, and secondly, we'll share in that prosperity. That our homes are free from violence and crime. There is evidence, and there is a new survey that's being conducted annually that now starts to give us better measures of background levels of offending. The real problem has been that probably only about 1 in every 6 offences is recorded in the official statistics. And so, it's all very well saying that reported crime rates are falling, but you don't really know whether they're falling or not, because rates of reporting and rates of prosecution have changed from one year to another. So what the police tell us and what Statistics New Zealand tell us about crime is really just a fraction of the picture. And certainly there is a newer crime and victim survey, which I think is a lot more useful in terms of telling us what's happening to background offending. And it does appear, despite the rhetoric of the past, that offending rates are falling. It's still the case that the most violent place in New Zealand is the home. It's still the case that you're most likely to be assaulted by someone you know and probably someone you're related to. And it's still the case that most of the crime happens to a very small proportion of the population. And that we do need to deal with that. And I think there has been a pattern of starting to try and take those things seriously by the way in which crime is being prosecuted. In particular, there's a great deal more emphasis being placed on family violence. So what we see in terms of the increasing prison population, in terms of increasing prosecution and conviction for violence, is, I think, a greater attention to this problem, not necessarily a greater incidence of such violence in our society. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not certain that sending people to prison is the best thing for them, but the reality is, at least I think this government, the previous one, has taken this problem more seriously than perhaps we ever have. But if we start to look at what's happening behind the scenes, particularly around methamphetamine use, and every year it gets worse. And it just seems to me to be one of probably the 5 biggest social problems we face as a society, that we really do need to tackle this problem with far more effort and more resolve than we have. And we've spoken at SPPU about what that means for the mix of our drug enforcement and drug policy, but it's certainly the case that methamphetamine and, to a degree, synthetic so-called synthetic cannabis are massive problems and need to be dealt with more seriously. And certainly that's behind much of the offending and the violence and the imprisonments that we're seeing. There's no evidence, however, that we're drinking less harmfully, and there's no evidence that we're gambling less harmfully. There is some evidence, for example, that older people now are drinking more hazardously, and so it's becoming a hazardous drinking isn't a young person, although they do drink more hazardously than older people, but older people are habitually drinking more hazardously, and younger people are starting to change their behaviours. Certainly the case too that if you look at problem gambling, that much of the problem gambling, and this is one of those things that I think is underreported as well, much of the problem gambling are relapsed problem gamblers. That people are coming back into the program after having had some sort of response that's allowed them to break out of their addiction. And one of the things that we've done this year too is to frame usurious debt, payday lenders, loan sharks as a social hazard. And certainly our suggestions are that while the indicators that we're using aren't absolute in terms of telling us exactly what's happening to those sorts of debts, it does appear that it's rising maybe by about 10% a year. And so one of the things that we're really clear on is that we do need to introduce maximum interest rates, and we do need to start to take usurious debt and payday lending and loan sharking far more serious, because it is a social hazard. It does trap people in poverty and does need to be seen as in that framing. Finally, housing. We've met something of a milestone in terms of hitting a 40-year high in terms of the number of consents being issued, which is interesting really, given our economy's probably doubled in size and it's taken us 40 years to get back to the numbers of houses that we were building in the early 70s. But the reality is that we are starting to build houses at the volume that's required. Certainly for the first time in about 7 years, the number of consents issued in Auckland has roughly matched the population growth. And that, I think, is partly responsible for the fact that house prices in Auckland are falling. And I think not only are they falling, they're falling more than we think. That's not to say that they're affordable, it's just to say that they're not going up, and that we would have to see something like a 20% fall in prices for us to get back to where we were 5 years ago. But outside of Auckland, the picture isn't so rosy, as we know in Wellington, that there's been this contagion, the spreading of the Auckland problem of excess housing demand and rising house prices out to other parts of the country. And I think the Army's seeing that in the demand for its services in places like Napier and Rotorua, where we're seeing 5 years ago the government said there was no need for state housing because they were empty. Now we're seeing the relatively long state housing lists in those places. We're seeing literally people not being able to find a house because there's just nothing available. And it's simple. People have left Auckland, bought houses or rented houses in those places and literally crowded out those people. So the housing market is a tale of two sort of cities. or 3 cities really. One is Wellington, prices are rising, Christchurch prices are falling, and Auckland prices are falling, but for slightly different reasons. So that's our analysis. Once again, it's not clear cut. It's a mixed message, but I think it's a fair one. It's one that's backed by some evidence, and it's a story that we should tell. And certainly, I've said that I won't be disappearing. I will be disappearing from the Salvation Army, but I'll still be here because I'll probably work behind the scenes quietly. But certainly, I'd ask you to really start to push the idea of this gaps table as something that the Army wants to speak to, because to me these gaps are appalling. And as Pākehā, I mean, most of us here are Pākehā, but as Pākehā we really just can't, I don't think, tolerate this anymore. I think it's a blight on us all in the same way that the mosque shootings were a blight on us all, and I just think we should accept this as something that's a priority for us. So thank you. Any questions? Oh, sorry. Is there another slide? Oh, yeah. God, I love this one. Ages ago, and I'll leave you with this. Ages ago, I saw this documentary on television. It was about Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Does anyone know much about Lyndon Baines Johnson? He was maligned because of the Vietnam War. But the other thing he did was he led the war on poverty in the US. He was responsible for, I think they're called financial aid to families with dependent children. And he was also the one that he was the guy massively behind civil rights. It wasn't the Kennedys, it was Johnson. And this is him being sworn in following Kennedy's assassination. And when he was standing for re-nomination for the presidency in 1968, he was so unpopular that he worked out he wasn't even going to get the nomination, let alone the presidency. And so soon in the campaign, he decided that was it. And I think he was so discouraged by the war in Vietnam that he just gave in. But he said this, and he said, "We know there's injustice, we know there's intolerance, we know there is discrimination and hate and suspicion, and we know there is division among us. But there is a larger truth. We have proved that great progress is possible. We know how much still remains to be done, and if our efforts continue, and if our will is strong, and if our hearts are right, and if courage remains our constant companion, then, my fellow Americans, I am confident we shall overcome." And of course, that reference to "we shall overcome" was a civil rights reference. This was a white Southern Democrat using the civil rights rhetoric. And I am confident too that if courage remains our constant companion as a society, we shall overcome these problems. And so, I just think that we need to be inspired, that greater and better things are possible if we're courageous and true.